Can you give me chapter and verse on the Maya Forstater story? It's quite extraordinary.
Yes, exactly. So I've just been reading a piece in the Independent on this, basically suggesting, Mark, that those who believe in biological sex being an immutable fact, which Maya Forstater does, who lost her, basically took her job, former employer, to court, but for arguing that sex is different from gender. That, some argue, is enough for you to lose your job. Now, I don't want to speak on Maya's behalf, but Maya's view, it seems to me, is that your gender identity can change, but your sex is an immutable fact. What you're born as at birth, were you to ask most of the British people, I think actually they'd say, well, anyone who self identifies as a woman, for example, shouldn't be able to access single sex spaces like women's changing rooms, bathrooms, refuges, and all of the rest of it. She's actually arguing in a similar way to J.K. Rowling that sex matters. And some are arguing that that should be enough to see her removed from gainful employment. And basically, what this argument says is that unless you endorse the dogma of gender identity, you're unemployable. Unless you come up with the sort of the I guess, desire to preach at the altar of the woke, ever changing as it is, mind, then you shouldn't receive gainful employment. It's an attempt, a naked attempt, to terrify those with ordinary common sense views into submission and self censorship. And it's another story. We're very free speech focused today. It's another
Yeah.
story and another sign that I think this country needs to really fight back as far as free speech is concerned.
Given this verdict, where do you think this debate goes around the identification of your gender and your sex? How do you think this plays out?
Well, I actually think that this argument is only going to get worse because I think that, for example, if sex doesn't exist, being homosexual doesn't exist. If sex doesn't exist, as I say, single sex spaces for women don't exist. And it's all of these things where actually people I speak to are absolutely aghast at this stuff being proposed. They're absolutely aghast at the lack of common sense around these issues and actually the dangerous elements of them, where you've got people in prison who can self-identify as women. This is cartoon stuff, but it's actually incredibly dangerous. So I'd like to see it played out where we actually have rational debate about these matters. I've got nothing against trans people whatsoever.
Of course.
As I say, it's not gender identity that I think people like me, or indeed Maya Forstater, again, I don't want to speak on her behalf or J.K. Rowling's behalf. But the only problem is that once you say sex doesn't exist, once you say that our language means nothing, and we've had those tools for years and years and years around sex, then you start to chip away at our society and the way in which we've operated for much longer than I've been on this earth, Mark.
And this distinction between gender and sex is the mainstream view. Maya Forstater is not an eccentric outlier and she's not transphobic.
Exactly, but that's what you'll be told. That's what you'll be they'll say basically anyone transphobic shouldn't be able to get a job or any job whatsoever. But she's not transphobic. All she's saying is that actually, as a feminist, I'd quite like my sex-based rights to be protected. And it strikes me as really, really odd that the left have done this shift in my lifetime, actually, from going from being champions of women and big supporters of women's rights to actually saying, well, to hell with those rights because they're trumped by what someone says they identify as. This stuff, I would say it's cartoon, but it's actually not. It's actually really dangerous, and it gets into territory which I think we shouldn't be endorsing in this country, and especially around children. That's one that I could go on and on about this, Mark, but I won't. But around kids as well, what we're doing to kids, I think, is completely unconscionable in this area.
Oh, yes. And there's a brilliant video that you alerted me to on your fantastic channel, by the way. I'd urge everyone to have a look at it. Reasoned UK on YouTube. It's Darren's channel, and he's interviewed somebody on that very issue of gender and gender assignment. And it's a complex issue, but deconstructed brilliantly by Darren and his guest at Reasoned UK on YouTube. Thanks, Darren. See you in a week's time. The brilliant Darren Grimes. After this,